And welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and today we'll be examining one of the most famous stories in naval history. On March 15th, 1790, Lieutenant William Bligh walked into the Admiralty building in London with an incredible story to tell. Bligh had just returned from a mission to Tahiti in 1787 to collect breadfruit trees and bring them to plantations in Jamaica. It was a relatively low priority assignment, one entrusted to an experienced navigator who once sailed with the famed Captain Cook. The mission, however, failed on April 28, 1789. Shortly after leaving Tahiti, his subordinate, acting Lieutenant Fletcher Christian, took hold of the ship in the event that would go down in history as the mutiny on HMS Bounty. Bligh and 18 of his most loyal crew members were loaded onto a small boat and cast adrift in the South Pacific, an act which the mutineers thought they could never survive. However, after navigating across 3,600 miles of open ocean, Lieutenant William Bligh brought all 18 of his crew members to a Dutch port in Kupang in modern-day Timor-Leste. Against all odds and on the brink of death, Bligh had saved his men. 321 days after the mutiny, Bligh returned to England, eager to seek revenge. The ensuing search for the mutineers captivated the public's imagination, as they all wondered, how could a mission to collect breadfruit trees in the South Pacific go so horribly wrong? This is the story of HMS Bounty. Beyond a thrilling adventure of the high seas, it's also a tale of the limits at which man can be pushed, and how the very systems created to keep order can be the same ones to unravel it. And in this review, we'll look at what led to the mutiny and how historically accurate the movie is, based on volumes of evidence collected from the personal journals and testimonies of several men on board the ship, as well as from court-martial evidence. We'll answer the question that everyone in 18th century England was dying to know: what happened on board that ship that led to mutiny? This is The Bounty. The modest mission to transport breadfruit trees from Tahiti to British plantations in Jamaica was orchestrated in part by Joseph Banks, a famed English naturalist who ran the Royal Society of London. He convinced the government that these plants might grow well in the Caribbean climate and provide cheap food for the slaves. For the task of collecting the crop from the South Pacific, Banks picked one man in particular, Lieutenant William Bligh. Having previously sailed with Captain Cook to Tahiti, he was already familiar with the customs of the indigenous people. In addition, he was also a skilled navigator, so Banks knew he'd be the right man for the job. Overjoyed at the prospect of captaining a ship, Bligh jumped at the opportunity. As a commoner, Bligh was someone who fought hard to rise through the Navy's ranks. Compared to sons of the nobility, it was rare for someone like him to find themselves in control of ships. But Bligh was a gifted navigator, or as Caroline Alexander writes in her book, The Bounty, The True Story of the Mutiny on the Bounty, Bligh was widely experienced, having served in times of war, in voyages of discovery, and in the merchant trade, from the Pacific to the West Indies. He learned much from his time with Captain Cook, and later implemented many of Cook's practices on board the Bounty. He was determined to not only complete this mission, but to circumnavigate the globe and keep all of his men alive in the process.
It lacks glory, William.
Well, I don't have your connections, you see, Fletcher. I want to make a name for myself before I'm too old.
And this green grocery trip will make your name.
The Bounty was a small unrated ship. It was classed as a cutter, the smallest warship class in the Navy, and it measured about 85 to 1/3 feet long and 220 tons. When it launched, it only held 46 men. Because it was not a rated ship, it didn't require a master and commander to run. Master and commander is a title, not a rank given to lieutenant commanders. Only lieutenant commanders or higher could captain a rated warship. However, since the Bounty was an unrated cutter, Bligh didn't need to be promoted to captain it, so he remained a lieutenant. This has important consequences for our story. Typically, the captain has a detachment of Marines on board voyages that serve as protection. They also help defend the ship against enemies, but their primary job is to keep the captain safe. In addition to the Marines, a captain would have a whole slate of officers on board to help run the ship. For example, when Captain Cook sailed his first voyage on the Endeavour in 1768, he had 2 lieutenants on board. On the Terra and Erebus expedition 1845, Captain Sir John Franklin and Francis Crozier each had 3 lieutenants that accompanied them, and Franklin even had a separate commander, whereas Lieutenant William Bligh was the only full officer on board the Bounty. He was not offered a promotion to lieutenant commander because the Bounty didn't require one as an unrated ship. This means that Bligh had no Marines to protect him and no officers to support him. What Bligh did have were the usual set of warrant officers on board all ships: a master, a boatswain, carpenter, and surgeon, among others. Warrant officers are below full officers like Bligh in rank. They're usually tradesmen with skills who are granted a slightly higher position than enlisted men. The master, his mates, and the midshipmen were usually the sons of nobility. Below them are the enlisted sailors, oftentimes brought aboard as able seamen, and were usually recruited by force through press gangs or joined to escape punishment. This was extraordinary. Bligh was going to sail around the world with no protection, even though the Bounty was officially designated as an armed vessel.
I only say the Bounty is too small. We should have a frigate, not a chamber pot.
Yes, and I should have promotion to captain. But the Navy Board would not heed either request. See?
This tells us that the Royal Navy saw the Bounty expedition as a low-priority trip, one that didn't require a larger rated vessel with a master and commander to sail it. The Bounty only carried 4 short 4-pounder carriage guns and 10 half-pounder swivel guns, which historian Caroline Alexander notes as laughably meager firepower. So why wouldn't the Royal Navy see this as high priority? Why not invest more money to get Bligh a promotion and a bigger rated vessel? They certainly knew the potential dangers in the South Pacific. James Cook reported in 1770 of seeing the Maori in New Zealand engage in cannibalism, and yet Bligh sailed unprotected into the unknown. At the same time Banks was procuring a ship for his breadfruit expedition, Britain was preparing for war against his longtime rival France. Britain's American colonies had only recently won their independence, and France had assisted the Americans against the British. The two nations often had naval skirmishes, so warships were held for the possibility of war. So sending a master and commander in a warship on what could be described as a grocery errand would have been deemed unfathomable. Britain's intuition would be proven correct. The French Revolution began whilst the Bounty was at sea, and Britain later fought France in the Napoleonic Wars. So anyway, despite Banks's influence, His Majesty's government didn't want to expend the resources required to send a fully outfitted ranked warship to the South Pacific. As a result, Bligh kept his rank and captained the Bounty. Oh, and an important note about terminology here. As we've learned, Bligh was not ranked as captain, but since he was in charge of the ship, it was a title that he held, so respect would dictate his men address him as captain. Bligh set to work on getting his crew sorted for the trip. Undaunted by the Bounty's shortcomings, he affectionately called it his little ship. The first person Bligh brought on was John Fryer, who would serve as the sailing master. Fryer was older than Bligh, but wasn't likely to be promoted beyond a warrant officer. The two had a fractured relationship from the start, and it caused problems throughout the entire voyage. In the film, we see friction between the two before they've even sailed.
Yes, but why risk going round the Horn?
Why? Because it is the quicker route, Mr. Fryer.
Well, quicker if we strike the 1 week in 100 when there isn't a storm raging.
Oh, so you would have us go the long way, round Africa and Australia, there and back. Avoid the Horn altogether.
This isn't friendly banter between friends. As the lieutenant and commander of the Bounty, William Bligh was in charge. The captain on board a ship had all the power and authority of the King of England. His subordinates, even warrant officers like Master Fryer, were to follow orders and respect his authority, especially in the presence of other crew members. Bligh's plan was to sail past the tumultuous Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, while Fryer proposed sailing past the established and much calmer Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. Regardless, even if Bligh agreed that the Cape of Good Hope was a safer option, his orders and sailing plan would have come from the Admiralty, not Bligh himself. In addition to sailing Cape Horn, the Naval Office gave Bligh orders to sail through the Endeavour Straits between the northern tip of Australia and Prince of Wales Island on the return trip home. Caroline Alexander writes in her book that the navigation and survey of this important, little-known and dangerous passage where Cook himself had run aground was of great interest to the Admiralty, and there are few naval officers better qualified or available to undertake this than Captain Cook's able sailing master, William Bligh. This is where the movie starts to mess with the chain of command structure to build up some suspense between the characters. While Bligh in real life did have to deal with a lot of disobedience on board, it's purposely ramped up in the movie to show the discord between Bligh and the rest of his crew. In addition to Master Fryer, Bligh approaches family friend Fletcher Christian to join him on the voyage. Bligh and Christian had previously served together doing merchant ship runs to the Caribbean. Fletcher served under Bligh as the master's mate, a role he would also perform on the Bounty. Bligh took Fletcher Christian under his wing to mentor him and promised that if Fletcher was to join the Bounty, then Bligh would help him get promoted to lieutenant on their successful return home. Bligh assembled the rest of his 46-man crew, and before long they were ready to sail. When he finally got his orders to leave Portsmouth for Tahiti by the way of Cape Horn, it was December 23rd, 1787. Early in the trip, Bligh writes in a personal letter to his uncle that, and I quote, I am happy and satisfied in my little ship, and we are now fit to grant half a score of worlds, both men and officers, tractable and well disposed, and cheerfulness and content in the countenance of every one. I am sure nothing is more conducive to health. I have no cause to inflict punishments, for I have no offenders, and everything turns out to be my most sanguine expectations. As it turns out, conditions on board the Bounty were not as cheerful and content as Bligh believed. Somewhere between launch and their arrival on Tahiti, the seeds of discontent had been sown, which eventually sprouted into Fletcher Christian's infamous mutiny almost a year and a half later. Although Bligh adopted many ideas from his mentor Captain Cook, his biggest takeaway from those voyages was to keep his crew healthy.
More men have died at sea from drink, disease, and dirt. Never died by drowning. Depend upon it, gentlemen. I am determined that the Bounty shall not lose a single man.
Bligh knew that going through the rough wind and seas at Cape Horn would be difficult, so he was determined to keep his crew fit. The traditional watch had sailors on duty for 4 hours, with 4 hours of sleep on repeat. Bligh changed this and instituted 3 watches, so each group of men could get an unbroken 8 hours of sleep. Bligh also had his crew wash the ship daily with vinegar to disinfect it, and was hyper-vigilant in checking their fingernails for dirt. When one did have dirty hands, he took away their daily grog. But perhaps Bligh's most infamous way of keeping his crew fit was in his compulsory dancing. Here are Bligh's own words recorded from a log. "Some time for relaxation and mirth is absolutely necessary, and I have considered it so much so that after 4 o'clock, the evening is laid aside for their amusement and dancing. I had great difficulty before I left England to get a man to play the violin, and I prefer to take a man who is 2/3 blind than come without one."
A crew on a long voyage may easily fall into melancholy and violence. I believe this can be relieved by regular exercise. So, for 20 minutes each day, I had the crew mustered and I had them dance.
Dance?
Yes, they danced.
An activity they participated in wholeheartedly?
I think so, yes.
In reality, his men danced for more than 20 minutes a day, and they hated Bligh for it. I'm not sure why the movie downplays the length of these compulsory dances, but Bligh himself wrote in a letter to Joseph Banks that they would dance from 4 p.m. until 8 p.m. The movie does, however, capture the discontent between how Bligh felt about his methods versus what his men believed. Bligh frequently wrote that his crew were happy and content, when in reality they hated the forced dancing and his strict measures of keeping clean. The one man on the Bounty who should have been as focused on cleanliness as Bligh was the surgeon, a man named Thomas Huggin. As accurately depicted in the movie, Huggin was a drunk and Bligh resented him. He frequently called him a drunken sot and a beast in his personal journal, and felt undermined in his attempts to keep the crew healthy, whereas the surgeon was always in a state of disarray. Unfortunately for Bligh, his drunken surgeon ended up being responsible for the first death on the Bounty, something Bligh worked hard to prevent. In the movie, we're told that the man who died is James Valentine, which is correct, but then it says he died from an illness he picked up after Cape Horn, whereas in real life he died from an infection after Surgeon Huggin bled him from an ailment he picked up in Tasmania. Despite this minor change, the movie still accurately has Bligh blaming the surgeon for Valentine's death. Now, whilst tragedies like this were not uncommon, the real shock was in Bligh not finding out until much, much later. Nobody, not even Master Fryer, had informed Bligh of the imminent death, revealing a breakdown in the chain of command and of Bligh's order and respect on the ship. One of the most pivotal scenes in the movie that shows the conflict between the captain and his crew takes place during Bligh's attempt to take the Horn. For 31 days, the crew fought hard to make it through, but failed. The film does a great job of showing the dangers of manning a ship in stormy weather, but then shows a chaotic conversation between Lieutenant Bligh and Master Fryer.
We must stand back! What? In my opinion, we should put about.
In my opinion, we should not, sir.
We keep on our course! You'll never make it round the Horn! We must stand back!
Mr. Cole! Mr. Cole!
I want my opinion in the log, sir!
Mr. Cole! Have that lashed out and all the men on deck now!
I want my opinion in the log!
Very well, Mr. Fryer. If that's what you wish, you should
The
have
ship
it.
can't stand it!
The ship can stand it very well,
And
sir.
how long do you think the men can stand it?
As long as the officers can stand it, Mr. Fryer.
Now, whilst Fryer did have a history of publicly disagreeing with Bligh, it's what happens next in the movie that's inaccurate. After turning back from the Horn, Bligh writes a letter to his wife about his altercation with Fryer and his doubts on the man's commitment to the mission. And what he decides to do next is a huge breach of Navy protocol.
We will go about and run downwind for Africa and the Indian Ocean. Mr. Lamb?
Here, sir.
As soon as we have put about, it will be safe to light your galley fires again,
Tonight I want as much hot mush as every man can eat.
That's ready for the captain, lads. Hip hip.
Hooray! Hooray! Hooray!
However, we are still faced with a long, hard voyage. I mean to make good use of every hour of sailing time. And to assist me in this, I'm replacing Mr. Fryer with Mr. Christian, who will now act as executive second in command with the rank of acting second lieutenant. Mr. Fryer, come back here. Mr. Fryer, sir, come back here!
Make no mistake, this did not and would not ever happen on a Royal Navy ship. Mr. Christian was promoted, but it happened way before they tried to sail around Cape Horn. In real life, Fletcher Christian was promoted to acting lieutenant on March 2nd, 1787. This was to give him more practice as a warrant officer and would help ensure his promotion upon return to England. He did not replace Mr. Fryer as master of the ship and would still have performed the duties of a master's mate. Fletcher's promotion to acting lieutenant would have been temporary and would have ended upon their safe return. To replace a master with his own mate is a serious breach of protocol, something no lieutenant in the Navy would do. This scene was simply added for drama and to enforce the narrative that Bligh was a tyrant, something many of his own men would later testify to in the court-martial. And while Bligh's controversial temper and tyranny as the lieutenant in charge of the Bounty are worth exploring, this scene from the movie oversteps that line. Part of Bligh's temper and strict adherence to the rules was because he was alone, without Marines or officer support. His discipline was first tested in Tasmania by his carpenter, William Purcell. Now, whilst Purcell doesn't feature heavily in the movie, in real life, he was incredibly insolent. After abandoning Cape Horn, Bligh and his crew sailed uneventfully to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, where they spent over a month recovering. From there, they crossed the southern Indian Ocean to Tasmania, where Bligh sent his carpenter Purcell ashore to gather wood. For some reason, Bligh had an issue with the way Purcell was cutting up the wood and made his opinions known. In response, Purcell lashed out and accused Bligh of coming ashore just to find an excuse to complain. Bligh then lost his temper and ordered Purcell back to the ship.
The Royal Navy is not a humorous institution, sir, and insubordination is no laughing matter.
And here was the big conundrum. This level of insolence on any other mission would be a court-martialable offence, as a subordinate had just violated the Articles of War, which govern the laws aboard a ship. However, Bligh was without Marines or officer support on a ship with now only 45 other men, and all able hands were needed to keep it running. Had Bligh been on a larger ship with more crew, Purcell would have been locked up in confinement until they returned home. But in Bligh's own words, "I cannot bear the loss of an able working and healthy man." He also couldn't flog Purcell as he was a warrant officer and gentleman, so physical punishments were off the table. In the end, Bligh didn't have many options, and Purcell knew it, and continued to be insolent. This was a big part of what led to the eventual mutiny on the Bounty. Bligh was alone, without support from other officers, without Marines, and without having a larger crew. Bligh couldn't do anything about discipline. All he had was his leadership, and after the debacle with Cape Horn, his men were starting to question it. With Purcell, Bligh's men had witnessed a breach of conduct, which ordinarily would have resulted in imprisonment and a court-martial, but instead, nothing happened. James Morrison, one of the later mutineers and the boatswain's mate, wrote in his log that in Van Diemen's Land were sown seeds of eternal discord between Lieutenant Bligh and the carpenter, and it'll be no more than true to say with all the officers in general. Later, after leaving Tasmania, 2 men refused to participate in the nightly dancing. Gunner's mate John Mills and assistant gardener William Brown outright refused the compulsory routine. In her book, Catherine Alexander speculates that perhaps the higher temperature was taking a toll, or perhaps the men were just fed up with what they regarded as tedious nonsense. Regardless, Bligh took away their grog. Bligh thought that running a clean, tight ship was paramount to a successful mission with minimal death, as well as discipline and a clear chain of command. If it worked well for Captain Cook, then it should also work well for him. But the thing Bligh didn't take into account is that he wasn't Captain Cook. The men saw him as an oppressive tyrant. Since he alone was instituting his tyranny, Bligh became the sole focus of the crew's anger. However, the men begrudgingly tolerated their conditions, simply because they had no other option. They were far from home, on a ship, with no way to return, except to complete the journey. This changed, however, once the men experienced life in Tahiti. Because of the monsoon season, Bligh knew from the outset that they would be stuck in Tahiti for longer than intended. When they arrived in April, they wouldn't be able to leave until October or November at the latest. From their time at Tahiti, it was clear that Bligh didn't let up on his tight control of the ship. For example, Bligh learned from his previous expeditions with Captain Cook that when the men barter with the indigenous population themselves, the whole local economy falls apart. So instead, Bligh took full control of the flow of goods on board the ship and then rationed them to the men. Everything from food to trinkets was handled this way. Bligh saw it as a way to prevent chaos and confusion, but his men saw it as further proof of his tyranny. James Morrison, the boatswain's mate, wrote, "Mr. Bligh seized all that came to the ship, big and small, dead or alive, taking them as his property, and serving them as the ship's allowance at £1 per man per day." But instead, the sailors encouraged their Tahitian friends to avoid Bligh and deliver them the goods anyway, undermining the entire system. This is not how a ship operates in the Royal Navy, where respect is due to one's superior regardless of personal feelings. The men felt emboldened by the lack of support Bligh had, and perhaps even that Bligh was not a master and commander, but merely a lieutenant. In the 5 months that his men were stationed at Tahiti, they started to immerse themselves in Tahitian life. Several sailors, Fletcher Christian included, got tattoos on their backsides, something that the local men got before they were eligible to marry. And, as accurately depicted, some of the bounty men took Tahitian wives and fathered Tahitian children. All the while Bligh was focused on his mission, his crew were increasingly falling in love with this absolute paradise on Earth. And the longer the breadfruit plantings took, the harder it would be for them to leave. Despite all this, Bligh attempted to keep order. When men disobeyed him or lost things to theft, they were flogged. The warrant officers couldn't be flogged though, so they were just confined to their cabins for periods of time. And, as accurately depicted in the movie, 3 men even deserted for a few days until they were found and flogged also. Master-at-Arms Charles Churchill, Cook's assistant William Muspratt, and able seaman John Millward. All of these men were later part of the mutiny. In order to ensure the success of the breadfruit plantings, Bligh sent his most trusted man to live on shore to oversee the operation, Fletcher Christian. At this time, the relationship between Bligh and Fletcher Christian was still stable. In the movie, Bligh muses on this at his court-martial.
Was Fletcher Christian at this time still your friend and ally?
At that time, yes.
There was no indication of any resentment towards you?
No, none.
In his own log, Bligh even mentions that he never fought with Fletcher until after they left Tahiti, but what Bligh didn't see was how much the men were falling in love with Tahiti and their women. In the film and in real life, Fletcher Christian met and fell in love with Ma'autua, the daughter of King Tainar. After a whirlwind romance, she became pregnant, and the movie suggests that it was here, on Tahiti, where the mutiny truly began.
So it did begin at the ceremony?
No, sir, not at the ceremony. No, it was Fletcher Christian and the native girl.
You misunderstood the depth of the emotion between them?
Yes, I realize that now. I had assumed that it was simply youthful passion.
It takes more than an infatuated youth to make a mutiny. It takes a discontented crew.
The crew were anything but discontented, sir. Fletcher Christian corrupted them.
Yes, but what made them so easy to corrupt?
I don't know. It was the place itself.
After meeting the girl, Fletcher's behavior changes radically. He becomes more isolated and insolent. He shows up late to a dinner that Bligh practically forces him to attend. As a master's mate and acting lieutenant, it was customary for Fletcher Christian to have dinner with Bligh every few days. But once Christian fell in love with Ma'autua, he spent all of his time on the island and never on the ship. And this incensed the disciplinarian captain because in the Royal Navy, punctuality is paramount. For Fletcher Christian to show up late for dinner unsuitably dressed like this was a serious breach of conduct, and the movie accurately uses the time in Tahiti to chronicle Fletcher's breakdown in discipline. The longer he stayed on the island, the clearer it became that he never wanted to leave.
3 men jumped ship last night. Churchill was one of them. You don't seem surprised.
Now that it's happened, no, I'm not. I'm not surprised.
I must say I'm no longer surprised myself when I see the example being set by my first officer. Just look at yourself, man. Look at the way you're dressed. Come on. You're no better than one of these natives.
They are more natural than men who have nothing to restrain.
Mr. Christian, you will report to the ship before sundown. Is that understood?
No.
What did you say? You said no? Is that what you said? Is that what you said? No? All right. You will report to the ship immediately. Do you understand me? And you will stay on the ship. There will be no more mixing with the damned degenerate natives of these islands, by any of my officers or by any of my crew. You comprehend my meaning, sir? God!
This confrontation is a huge turnaround from how these two men were accurately depicted at the beginning of the movie, when they were having dinner with family, with Fletcher Christian kissing Bly's daughters goodnight. Anyway, the crew finally makes their goodbyes to paradise and leave Tahiti, but the discord between Bly and his crew only continued to get worse. We get a sense of this growing rift in the movie when Bly sits down to dinner with some of his warrant officers, including Fletcher Christian, to address the slacking discipline.
Now, the crew is deeply demoralized, gentlemen, and I must accept, as every captain must accept, the inevitable and theoretical responsibility for that. The actual and immediate responsibility, however, I place on you, my fellow officers, who met this crisis with lethargy, impotence, and flagrant defiance publicly uttered. And perhaps also for that I am to blame. So I counted on a strength of character which you do not possess. However, the cure for our predicament is discipline. And I shall apply it with an even hand, of course, but most where it is most required.
I love the way he says he takes theoretical responsibility. That's like the equivalent of saying sorry, but not sorry. Anyway, despite his promise to apply discipline with an even hand, Bly mostly just targets Christian. He starts off by saying he's only being harsh for his own good, and that more out to her is just a fling, nothing more. In a roundabout way, this is Bly's attempt to extend an olive branch, to restore their relationship to the way it was before Tahiti.
I am prepared to forgive, and I am prepared to forget. Do you understand me?
Will that be all, sir?
Yes, that will be all.
Thank you.
Instead, Christian snubs Bly's offer, and from that moment on, has a target on his back. Out of spite, Bly begins to abuse Christian. The next scene shows Bly admonishing him for a dirty ship, calling him out in front of the men. He then forces them to scrub the deck over and over and over again, regardless if they've been cleaned or not. The movie also accurately shows an incident where Bly accused Christian of stealing his coconuts, and called him a scoundrel and a thief, which, in those days, were fighting words. Then later, Bly calls the crew together to announce his plans to sail east, around Cape Horn again, and the movie makes it seem as though this was the turning point that pushed everyone over the edge, because this decision could mean putting their lives in danger. In reality, Bly didn't do this. He instead kept to the Admiralty's plan, which was to sail west from Tahiti, around South Africa, and back home that way. This decision by the filmmakers to have Bly go for the Horn again was just for drama. The same can be said when Fletcher Christian tries to warn Bly against trying Cape Horn by explaining the men won't have it. Bly takes this warning poorly and gets defensive. Christian tries to explain that the men are afraid, even insinuating that they may rise up against Bly. But the meeting ends with Bly kicking Christian out of his cabin. Now, there are no records to suggest that this meeting happened either. Bly never intended to go back via Cape Horn, and Christian never warned his captain of a mutiny. I imagine those scenes were added to really highlight the discord between Bly and his crew, and more particularly, Bly and Fletcher Christian, to show that Bly was so focused on the end goal that he lost sight of the small signs of disobedience that would later lead to mutiny, which finally came 3 weeks later, on the 28th of April, 1789. That night, Fletcher Christian, Charles Churchill, and two other men crept into Bly's cabin and grabbed the captain as he slept. Bly screamed for help, hoping to rouse the sleeping warrant officers, but unfortunately for him, those who weren't in on the plan had been grabbed at the same time. Bly and the other prisoners were taken above deck and bound, with the mutineers egging on Fletcher Christian as the two finally came to blows.
Mr. Christian, I appeal to you, sir. Put aside this madness and it'll all be forgotten. I give you my word.
It's too late. It's too late.
Think of my family and my friendship. Think of my wife.
I am in hell! Hell, sir! Why are you being so damned reasonable now?
So here's a fun fact. That famous line, "I am in hell," was really said during the mutiny. This was corroborated by multiple accounts and logs. But in any case, Fletcher Christian and the mutineers loaded Bly and 18 other crew members into the Bounty's launch. They gave them 5 days worth of rations, which they thought would be more than enough for the castaways to make it to the nearest island. Now, not all of the men loyal to Bly were allowed to leave with him. There were several who were forced to remain behind. Whether it was because there was no room left on the launch or the mutineers needed their skills is up for interpretation, but Bly promised these men that he would exalt exonerate them upon his return to England. Later that same day, Bligh and his loyalists arrived at the nearby island of Tafua and were approached by the natives. But, unlike their Tahitian neighbours, the Tofuans weren't friendly. In the movie we see them clicking stones together, which is an historically accurate detail that was directly lifted from Bligh's account. From his past travels with Cook, Bligh knew that when South Pacific Islanders started to bang stones together, it was a precursor to fighting. Bligh immediately ordered his men back onto the boat and to throw their clothes overboard to distract the Tofuans. Quartermaster John Norton jumped out of the boat to try and help the others, but was sadly stoned to death by the islanders. Bligh and his remaining crew agreed that if they wanted to survive, they could not stop at any more islands for fear of this happening again. Instead, they would sail for the nearest European colony, which, unfortunately, was thousands of miles away. And the way their journey is depicted in the movie is extremely accurate. With their meager rations stretched to the limit, the men began to starve. Things got so bad that Bligh faced the threat of a second mutiny on his hands. In this case, the carpenter William Purcell, and this altercation between him and Bligh really happened.
Some of us haven't had nothing in days.
That's enough, Purcell.
Well, it's not enough for me, sir! I'll tell you something. The officers in that lock get everything!
Shut your mouth, Purcell.
I'm as much a man as you are, sir!
What did you say?
I said I'm as much a man as you are!
Ah, you stink. I'm not so certain about that. Put it down, damn you! I'll knock you on the head with it! Sit down! Sit down!
By all accounts, the mutineers never expected Bligh to survive. But he did. In a brilliant show of his skills as a navigator, Bligh managed to guide the open boat for 3,618 miles from Tafua to the Dutch-controlled port city at Kupang in Timor-Leste, with no charts or maps, using only a compass. For the entire 74 days they spent at sea, absolutely none of the men died in the Bounty's launch. Only after landing in the notoriously malaria-infested Kupang that some later fell to disease. But that was it. In any case, regardless of how harsh Bligh may have been with his crew in an attempt to keep discipline, this trip absolved him. Exhausted and half dead, Bligh and his crew stumbled ashore and met with the Dutch. Bligh managed to find a ship heading to England, and over the next few months the surviving men came home. 321 days after Fletcher Christian forced him overboard, William Bligh marched to the Admiralty and reported him for treason. William Bligh was acquitted in his court-martial of any wrongdoing that led to the mutiny. Shortly after, he was promoted to captain and sent out on another mission to, get this, Tahiti. Since the first wasn't successful, Joseph Banks, the naturalist at the heart of the first mission, successfully lobbied for Bligh to try again. This time though, as captain, he was given a larger ship, but Bligh refused to go unless he had no fewer than 12 Marines, a request which was granted. The second voyage was successful and happened without major incident. In the period between Bligh's two voyages to Tahiti, the Royal Navy sent a ship in search of the mutineers. The Pandora sailed by Captain Edward Edwards. Interestingly, one of the surviving midshipmen from the Bounty, Thomas Hayward, went with the Pandora to find the mutineers, as he would be able to recognize them instantly. Although the Pandora had its own struggles and sank on the Great Barrier Reef, it was successful in capturing 16 of the mutineers who were found in Tahiti, but not the main target, Fletcher Christian. After the mutiny, Christian took the ship back to Tahiti. He reunited with his wife Ma'autawa and petitioned King Taina for some men and supplies. He reasoned, rightfully so, that if Bligh survived, the Royal Navy would come looking for him, so he couldn't stay in Tahiti. 16 of the mutineers decided to stay anyway, and they were summarily rounded up by the Pandora in March 1791, almost 2 years after the mutiny. While the Pandora was given a list of islands to visit to find Fletcher Christian, he was never found. Of the mutineers detained in Tahiti, 10 made it back to England alive. 4 of them were acquitted quickly, as they had no part in the mutiny but weren't allowed to leave the Bounty. William Bligh's prior testimony helped these men escape punishment for a crime they didn't commit. Of the 6 found guilty, 3 were hanged to death, and the other 3 successfully lobbied the government to be pardoned. As to what happened to Fletcher Christian and the others, their plan was to sail to an island where the Royal Navy could never find them, and they eventually settled on the Pitcairn Islands, some of the most remote islands in the world. The next closest island is Tahiti, 1,340 miles away. While Pitcairn did exist on Royal Navy maps, they were charted incorrectly, so Fletcher hoped they'd go undetected. However, finding Pitcairn would prove to be harder than expected. The mutineers spent 2 months on the open ocean with no land in sight, and in the movie there's a scene where the crew begin to turn on Christian, saying that they want to go back to Tahiti and take their chances there. Christian then takes Young, the only other navigator, hostage and forces them to keep going. Now, with the limited records we have of the mutineers, there's no mention of Christian ever doing this, but we do know by this point he was struggling keeping his group together. They resented him and their situation. So, although this scene is fictional, it is believable. In any case, on January 15th, 1790, they finally found it. Fletcher Christian and several of his closest companions lived on Pitcairn with their wives until their deaths. The first ship to dock at Pitcairn after the mutiny was the American whaling ship Topaz, captained by Mayhew Folger. Folger was surprised to hear the people on Pitcairn speaking English, and to his surprise, an islander asked him, "Don't you know my father? He's an Englishman. Did you ever knew Captain Bligh? My father sailed with him." 18 years after the mutiny on HMS Bounty, Mayhew Folger was speaking with Thursday October Christian, the son of Fletcher Christian and Ma'autawa. After all this time, only one of the mutineers was left alive on Pitcairn, able seaman Alexander Smith, although his real name was John Adams. Adams reported to Mayhew Folger and the other British ships who came later that all the other mutineers had died. Fletcher Christian, it is said, was killed in the night by some of the Tahitian men they brought to the island. The reason why was due to the tension between the Englishmen and the Tahitians, whom they treated as slaves, which eventually turned to bloodshed. One night, 4 Tahitian men stole muskets and attacked the Englishmen as they slept, and by the end of this micro-civil war, only John Adams was left. Others, however, believed that Christian jumped off a cliff, consumed by madness. One rumour even placed Fletcher Christian back in England, although there is no evidence to support this. Regardless of how it happened, Fletcher Christian conducted a mutiny, gathered up his wife, and fled to Pitcairn, never answering for his crimes in a court-martial. As for Bligh, he went on to have a successful captaining career in the Royal Navy until his death in 1817. 27 years after he lost his ship, his life and legacy was stained with the mutiny on the Bounty. Some placed the blame on his shoulders, pointing at his tyranny as the reason his men turned on him. But regardless, the Bounty remains one of the most fascinating stories of the period. Overall, I love this movie. For the most part, it is exceptionally accurate. It may fudge the chronology and some minor details for the sake of pacing, but it gives us a good idea of the tense relationships these men had. There are only a few moments here and there where the film oversteps the chain of command, like when Fryer openly questions Bligh's plan to sail around Cape Horn, or when Bligh demoted him in front of the crew, which, as I said before, did not and would not happen on board a Royal Navy ship. But despite this, the film does an excellent job of accurately portraying the major issues that led to the mutiny. For example, it sets up early that Bligh wasn't given a promotion or a properly rated ship, and as a result, we don't see the things that would normally be on board, like Marines or other officers. But we do see Bligh's isolation at the helm exacerbate the tensions that existed between him and his men, especially when the film cuts between scenes of Bligh's trial and his time on board the ship, showing the complete disconnect Bligh had with his version of events and that of his crew. In particular, those scenes where Bligh forces his men to dance do the best job of highlighting the moments when the men started to doubt their captain. So by the end of it, when Fletcher Christian leads the mutiny, you totally understand why things hit the fan. But the movie also fairly represents both parties here. Bligh and those loyal to him were following the rules and completing the Navy's mission, despite the hardship, whereas Fletcher Christian and the mutineers simply wanted freedom. When we see how cramped the ship was in those scenes when the crew's together eating dinner or listening to their captain speak, it's not hard to imagine how insufferable that must have been living like that for all those years, like the real crew did. In comparison, Tahiti offered the men everything they could never have on HMS Bounty: space, women, all the food they could eat, and freedom. You could not find a more tempting paradise. And the fact those scenes were even filmed in French Polynesia, not too far from where it all happened, is always a plus for me. And that's what I love about this movie. It's a human drama set on the high seas, one that muddies the line between right and wrong. It accurately showcases Fletcher Christian's psychological breakdown juxtaposed against Bligh's rigid leadership, which ultimately led to the mutiny. The Bounty is a must-watch film. It's about one of the most famous stories in naval history, and even if sailing movies aren't your thing, it's still an excellent depiction of how far someone can be pushed until they break. It's an accurate portrayal of what happened between these two men, once friends, whose decisions on board the Bounty cemented their place in history forever. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comment section what you thought about the Bounty. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.